First tonight, back to the latest in the federal election. And what a difference a week in the media spotlight makes when it comes to the political fortunes of Albanese and Scott Morrison. Last Sunday, as the campaign kicked off, the concern in the coalition was about Scott Morrison's lack of appeal to voters. 7 days later, the focus is entirely on Albanese's performance and whether he's even fit to be Prime Minister. This week has exposed his policy inexperience. More than that, the fact he's not across the detail. And this is a widespread view, not just one you're hearing on Sky News. Have a listen to the ABC's political editor, Andrew Probyn, today.
This was a real shocker of a first blunder. In terms of campaigns, think back at 2019. What do you remember? You probably remember two things. You remember Bill Shorten in tears, and you remember a bill that no one can afford. This particular occasion, this brain explosion from Anthony Albanese is something that will potentially define this whole campaign. In terms of numbers, not to forget, this was unforgivable.
And here's the West Australian front page again, not a News Corp newspaper. Have a look at that. Does he know his from his elbow? Well, Albanese's team has tried to paint this all as a simple mistake on a gotcha question. But with each day this week came a new error. On Monday, Albanese didn't know the unemployment rate. How can anyone not know the unemployment rate? The big story for months has been how the government has got the unemployment down to 4% despite the pandemic, and whether or not Josh Frydenberg is going to get it into the threes. Then on Tuesday, Albanese inflated his economic credentials when he claimed to be an economics advisor to the Hawke government. Then he announced a $135 million plan for bulk billing GP clinics, but it was slammed by the AMA, the Medical Association. Worse than that, Albanese said it had been costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office when it hadn't. The next day, he suggested he would shut down detention centres, and there was also a backflip on his plan to have a review into how much people on job seekers should receive. It got worse again today. Another bungle on boat turnbacks. And after this week, Labor MPs and staffers have unleashed on Albanese. They claim he is infamous for not properly reading his policy briefings and that he fails to do basic preparation. And this is all in a report by James Campbell that is front page of the papers this weekend. A very strong Courier Mail front page. One Labor MP told James Campbell that Labor supporters are now taking down posters and that morale has fallen apart inside the party. Another questioned why Albanese was having to introduce himself to voters after being in politics for 26 years. Just to clarify, these are not journalists or commentators saying that. This is Labor MPs. The reason Labor MPs are nervous is because this week has exposed that Albanese isn't across policy detail, not like other leaders have been or should be. On the GP clinic policy, Albanese claimed it had been fully costed. This means they know how much money the policy will actually cost to implement. It's important.
How many nurses and GPs will you require, and where will you find them if the cost relies on the Medicare benefits already just coming from hospital, where they're already doing hospitals across the GPs? Where do the extra workforce come from?
You will see, as part of the full costings that were done by us, you will see that there is not expected to be any cost, any additional cost on the MBS. And you'll see that when all of our costings will be released.
But in fact, this has not been costed by the parliamentary budget costings. It's a point that Shadow Finance Minister Katie Gallagher actually made on Twitter. Here she said the costing of Labor's urgent care centre policy is based on work done by the PBO, but for the avoidance of any confusion, it has not been formally costed by PBO. Then on
If people smugglers seek to take advantage of an incoming Labor government and do send more boats, will you be tough on boat turnbacks and will you consider an offshore resettlement deal?
We'll turn boats back. Turning boats back means that you don't need offshore detention.
And that was Albanese saying that he might walk away from offshore detention. He then realised this was a mistake when the news blew up, and he came out just an hour and a half later and had to do another media appearance where he walked back his comments. But that's not the end of the issue. Then today there was another error. Albanese indicated that he supported temporary protection visas. He nodded along as a journalist from The Australian asked this question.
Do you remain committed to Operation Sovereign Borders, and if so, do you support the retention of temporary protection visas?
Yes.
Then again, just minutes later, he backtracked on his remarks.
Earlier on, I heard half the question and didn't hear all of it. Labor's policy is to support Operation Sovereign Borders. We support offshore processing. We support resettlement in third countries. We don't support temporary protection visas.
This all reminds voters of Albanese's long-held opposition to boat turnbacks. He spent his entire career fighting against turning away boats and asylum seekers. In 2015, when Shorten supported turnbacks, Albanese voted against it.
I'm of the view that I would just find out. I couldn't ask someone else to do something that I couldn't see myself doing. And if people were in a boat, including families and children, I myself couldn't turn that around. I would want to make sure that they were safe and secure. That was the position that I came to.
And my guest coming on in just a minute, Mark Latham, he claims that Albanese has been close to tears over this issue in private meetings, and I'm going to ask Latham about that in just a moment. Now, the reason this matters, the reason this is problematic, is because these stumbles this week are in areas that are natural weak points for Labor, where Albanese needs to convince voters that he is across the detail when it comes to the economy, border protection. Turning back the boats could all become a big issue once again. It hasn't been in the news for years now, but the imminent collapse of the Sri Lankan economy is a major potential push factor for boat people to come to Australia. This week hasn't been all smooth sailing for the Prime Minister either, it has to be said. Albanese can claim wins over Morrison on his broken promise to set up a corruption watchdog, and also on the Liberal candidate for Warringah, Catherine Deves, who's made offensive transgender remarks on social media. But if Albanese thinks he can win an election on a platform of transgender issues and a corruption commission, then he's more out of touch than anyone realised. These issues are not of the utmost significance to voters, particularly in the suburbs and in regional areas. And even in the cities, people are concerned about these issues, particularly when it comes to what children are being taught in schools about gender fluidity and also the issue in women's sport. And it's why the Prime Minister has been sticking by his candidate, and it's a point Foreign Minister Marise Payne made today.
Ms Deves has apologised for those remarks. She has withdrawn those remarks, and that's the most important thing as she continues as the candidate there in Warringah. She has made that apology clear, but importantly, in relation to the issue that she has been discussing, I think we need to look at fairness, at safety and inclusion in terms of women in sport. This is a discussion that we should be having.
And also, it's important to note that Zoe Daniels, this is the former ABC journalist who's running as an independent in the Victorian seat of Goldstein. She has made insensitive remarks on social media on the topic of Israel, as has her campaign team. Her operations manager said Jewish groups should shut up. And as you know, I've reported all of this in The Australian and here on Sky News. Zoe Daniels has apologised, finally, belatedly, for those remarks, even though she told me when I wrote the stories that she was standing by her team. But Labor's not calling for her to stand down. just the Liberal candidate. And while Albanese is calling for an integrity commission, he won't even answer questions about whether he has misled the public over his own CV. As he sought to re-establish his economic credentials this week, Albanese claimed that he'd worked for the Hawke government.
I was employed as an economic policy advisor to a minister in the Hawke government. That's not a surprise, that's just a fact.
That was him the day after I exposed that he actually was a research officer. But the reality is even stranger than that. As I wrote about in Saturday's Weekend Australian, Albanese was not a ministerial economic advisor. He was an electorate officer. These parliamentary questions on notice, dated 1985, show he was electorate officer 1. And these ministerial directories from the years his boss, Tom Uran, was a minister, and that was 1983 to 1987, do not list Albanese as a ministerial staff member. And in Albanese's own biography, written by journalist Karen Middleton, for which he did cooperate, his title is referenced as an electorate officer. And Albanese talks about when he first went to Uran with Canberra. In his biography, he said he was a note-taker and an excited kid. He was 22 at the time. He only worked for Uran from 1985 to 1989, but Uran was just a minister for the first 2 of those years. And in Uran's autobiography, he wrote that in the first 2 years that Albanese worked for him, they barely spoke. Now, again, this isn't me just dredging up parts of Albanese's history from the 80s. This was Albanese in the wake of the stuff up over not knowing the unemployment rate and the cash rate. He sought to boost his economic credentials by saying he was an economic advisor in the Hawke government. But not only did he not advise senior figures in the Hawke government on its economic policies, but he was working for a minister who wasn't in cabinet. He was working as an electorate officer, and they both disagreed with all of the Hawke government's major reforms. For more on what exactly Albanese was doing at the time, I'm joined by someone who knew him back then, former Labor leader and now